Hey guys, this is a video on bias in the type community. So I've made some posts on this on Instagram, and I want to take a look at these over here on YouTube and talk about them for just a couple minutes. I don't want this to be a long video. But the first post I made was this post where we have the purported type distributions in the United States, I guess, from the MBTI manual. But when you go check this manual, there's no link to a study or anything. It just says, okay, well, this is just what we got. So I was like, okay, just a little curious about this. And it says, okay, ISTJ we should expect to be the highest percentage type in, I'm assuming, the United States. I'm assuming that's where they studied. And then we have INFJ as the least with 1.2% compared to 16.4%. So you get this funny result when you go on Instagram and you type in ISTJ personality or just ISTJ and INFJ. You get about 1,000 posts for ISTJ, the ISTJ personality type, and then you have ISTJ as the highest in the MBTI manual. Okay, and then if you look at INFJ, it's overwhelmingly, look at this, it's overwhelmingly more popular than ISTJ, which is supposedly the highest percentage type in the population of the United States. We've got about like 300 million people, so this should be close to 15, 20, between 15 and 20% of 300 million people, and then you have 1.2% of the population supposedly making up almost 100 million posts. So I thought that was interesting, and it brought up a lot of things. And I also did a comparison of Google Trend search of the search results for ENFP and ESFP. So if you look at 2000, the year 2000, or 2004, it's a bit skewed. It's pretty skewed. Then if you start moving along the x-axis, it's like, okay, well, there's a clear favorite. ENFP is definitely searched more, but in some instances, it's even 50-50. Once you get closer to 2020, or to 2021 rather, it's almost 100% search for ENFP, and then almost close to 0% searches for ESFP. And then if you look at that, you could say, okay, well, we're not too far into 2021, so these are, there's not that much information for 2021. But even so, if you look here between 2009 and 2015, this gap widens. Okay, and you'll hear some stock answers for to explain this within the type community, which usually are along the lines of, oh well, the people that are the ENFP type are more interested in this type of thing than people that are sensing types. And it's like, okay, well, if you look at that, you're like, okay, well, if you read psychological types and you read about an extroverted intuitive and you read about an extroverted sensor, it's like, okay, well, that really doesn't give you much grounds for making that claim, and to say, okay, well, people that are intuitives are going to be more interested in this specific type of stuff or this specific fad than ESFPs or sensing types in general. And also, it's also important to note that you have Jung, you have his disciples, so like von Franz writes about psychological type. You have other analysts such as Daryl Sharp, and they don't comment on this. So they don't say, they don't, it would be one thing to notice a trend, but then it would be another to actually have the experts that are writing about it say, hey, and this is just a general thing about type, is that people that are intuition types are generally more interested in this type of subject matter than sensing types. But they don't say that. And it's also a strange claim to make, because you have the people in the community claiming that there are more intuitives than there are sensors. Which is weird, because you have the interest thing and then you have the type distribution thing. Whereas we looked at, remember, ISTJ being purportedly 16% of the population by comparison to 1.2% of the population for INFJ that makes up overwhelmingly almost 100% of the posts by comparison to ISTJ. Which is weird, because you're like, okay, well, there's nothing about type that really says that this should be a thing, and none of the experts are saying this is something you should expect. So it's strange. And it's also almost 100%. And then if you look at it, it's like, okay, well, if this is 100% or even close, like you could say in years past, it's very close to there being 100% searches for ENFP relative to ESFP, and it's probably similar for the other types if you compare the intuitive version. If you're looking at the letters, the intuitive version to the sensing type version, it's like, okay, well, why if you think about it, why is this? Because you can predict things based on looking at people you already know are in the community. You can say, okay, well, it's likely that overwhelmingly if I join an MBTI group or a group that talks about type, it's going to be more intuitives. But it's like, okay, well, you know that because you already know that they're into type just by virtue of being in the group or have already heard of type. But it's not a diagnostic. This is the kicker, is that it's not a diagnostic. And the thing that becomes the most obvious to people that aren't already so entrenched in this viewpoint is that obviously you can't tell whether somebody's going to be into type based on their type. So if you type someone as ENFP and you type someone as ESFP and you have them like sit next to each other, it doesn't tell you, like, their type doesn't tell you anything about whether they've read about Myers-Briggs or they're into Myers-Briggs. You can't say, okay, well, I've typed this guy as ENFP, therefore I know I have a reason to believe that he is interested in Myers-Briggs. That's just not the case. Like, if you made that assumption and you talked to every person you typed as ENFP about Myers-Briggs, you would be hit with the reality that it's a very niche thing. You know what I mean? Not everybody's into it, but I mean, supposedly everyone has a type. So it's just a weird thing that people say, okay, well, intuition types are interested in this stuff because of their type, but then when you look at sensing types that are also interested in it, it's just by pure happenstance. It's like, okay, well, this guy's ENFP, so he's interested in this because it's somehow an extroverted intuition thing to read about this stuff. But then if you have a person who's an ESFP that's even deeper into it than the person that's ENFP, then it's just like, oh, they're just kind of into it because they just happen to like it. It has nothing to do with their type. So it's like there's a lot of conflation about what actually does and what doesn't, or what can and cannot be explained via type, because type isn't like an all-encompassing subject matter that explains everything that someone does. So yeah, we're about 8 minutes. There's a couple things here, but that's the major thing I wanted to bring up, is that a lot of people will say, oh, well, it's because of the person's type. And it's like, well, not necessarily. I think it's more likely that if you look at the community, it's not very hospitable to sensing types, and you have a lot of people just talking crap, or not even talking crap, just like people just downplay the strengths of sensing types. And so it's not really like, if you are a sensing type, you're like, okay, well, this is probably really isn't even the community for me, because nobody wants to talk about sensing types. Like, for example, if I post an ESFP post, I know almost nobody's going to like it or nobody's going to watch it. And that also tells you especially that it's close to 100% ENFP versus ESFP. Even if you take the Myers and Briggs stats, it should be 6.4% ENFP, 6.9% ESFP. Okay, and that's assuming those are right. That's assuming, and I don't even have a study to read to even look at how they took those stats. But it's like, okay, let's assume those are right. Then it's probably the case that there's some people mistyped, because I mean, it's using Google Trends to see all and look at all the searches on Google can tell you a lot about the community, and it's probably likely that people just do not want to identify as sensing types. So there's probably a lot of people that are mistyped, and they're saying, oh, well, I believe I'm ENFP for XYZ reasons. And even one of the reasons could be they're saying, well, I'm interested in this stuff. And people say if you're interested in it, then you're an intuitive type. But that's not necessarily how you would even type somebody to figure out whether they are an intuitive type, is whether or not they're into the Myers-Briggs. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to this. I'm not sure I covered every single thing I wanted to talk about, but that's definitely a good amount of the things. Like, just to recap, it's like, all right, well, you have these questionable statistics. You have that the intuitive people are saying, okay, well, it's mostly sensors in the real world, but the people that are interested in this are intuitive because it's an intuitive thing to be interested in it, but then don't explain why extroverted sensors or why sensing types would be interested in it. They're just like, oh, well, it just happens to be the case. And then also the experts, and I'm not talking about MBTI experts, they have something to gain from it. Like somebody that's making money off it, of course, they're going to say that. But like the Jungian people that use type don't say, okay, well, if you're interested in type, then that probably means you're an intuitive. So yeah, like I said, it's also it's definitely has to do with also the community just not being too friendly to sensing types and people just not wanting to say they're a sensing type just based on that. You're probably in the comments going to see some people just rehash this argument, even though I've said why it's kind of silly. But I mean, people love to hold on to their safety blankets when it comes to this stuff because the Myers Briggs really tends to be an emotional issue. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there. I may make another video on this because there's probably some things that skip my mind, but there you have it. There, this is a at least first foray into looking at the bias in MBTI because oh, the last thing. Now it came back to me. The last thing is like, okay, well, if this stuff wasn't purely like if this stuff wasn't purely biased and you were to say that okay, intuitives are into, because people will say, oh, intuitives are into psychological type and MBTI and all this stuff because they like getting to know people better, then why are they searching for their own type more than the sensing type? It's like, how can you even understand what sensation is if you don't search for the sensing types? Because like, look at this. It's like literally near 2021, and not even just then. If you look at other years, it's like there's almost no searches comparatively for ESFP versus ENFP. It's like, wouldn't you want to start there to learn about sensing types? Like you would, or to learn about sensation or even your own sensation. You would look at the sensing types. So it's like, I just don't understand this this bias because it's like, why wouldn't you look, if like I'm interested in this stuff, so I look at all types because I think that that's a good way to understand other people and it's a good way to understand the subject matter. But if you're just looking at your own type, there's definitely some bias, and I really think it has to do with the online community and the social aspects of that and the emotional aspects.